Hi, I'm Dr. Jason Cavich. I'd like to welcome you to the Thought Leadership Podcast. This is our inaugural podcast, and the hopes, mission, purpose of this podcast is centered around this. Life is challenging, life is hard, and what we're going to try and do is have experts, people who are foremost experts and scientists in all different walks of life, highly successful people, with the goal of learning from them while also discussing the scientific ramifications behind whatever the topic may be or whoever the presenter is, the guest is on that particular day. My name is Dr. Jason Cavich. My background, I have a PhD in management. I'm a professor of management. I've been a professor for about 25 years. I also have an MBA. I have a master's degree in religion. I've had a chance to teach business classes, religion, philosophy, ethics, etc. I'm also a certified independent director through the National Association of Corporate Directors, and I have an opportunity to work with boards. We're very fortunate today to have our guest, who is Carolyn Fitzpatrick. She has 25 years of experience in the tech space. Our topic today is going to be on artificial intelligence, technology, and history. Carolyn has master's degrees in technology and in history. Carolyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. I am glad to be here. So yes, thank you very much for that introduction. I am an instructional designer for the Huizenga College of Business and Entrepreneurship at Nova Southeastern University. And in case your listeners are not familiar with instructional design, it's not always a very well-known job title. Instructional design is the application of educational psychology to develop explicit instruction. So it is tailored to meet a specific organizational goal that has been identified by a business, by a school, by branches of government. There's all kinds of different organizations that use instructional designers to make videos or job aids or in-person trainings or online courses and so on and so forth. So that is my main, bread and butter, but my background is also in history as well. I have a master's degree from Florida Atlantic University, and I've taught history both online and in person at the college level and, K through 12 a bit as well. So I like to bring together history, technology, education, and it all fits together in very interesting ways sometimes.
Let's kind of jump into the main topic today, which is really, it's front and center domestically, globally, and it's the impact of artificial intelligence. So based on your background, your expertise, tell us what you know about AI, where's it going, what can we learn from history that could help us deal with this new tool?
Okay, well, to talk about the history and the origins of artificial intelligence, it's really intertwined with the history of computing as a whole. They've been working on artificial intelligence ever since they were trying to develop the very first computers. And so, if we want computers that can think, if we want intelligent computers, there's certain things that we have looked to see if computers are able to do this. So one of the very first ways that we looked at in science and technology is, can the computer play chess? Chess playing computers, this is the big test of intelligence if you think back to like the 1700s and 1800s. So
I've played a little bit in my past, but I'd have a lot of work to do with that.
I mean, that's about where I am too. I know the pieces, I know how they move, I know the basic rules of the game, but I don't know strategy or anything like that. And to the people of the Enlightenment, chess was the big game, that was used to determine whether you were an intelligent, sophisticated person or not. So the very first promoted chess playing robot was a device known as the mechanical Turk. Are you familiar with this device at all?
I'm not.
Okay, so the mechanical Turk was actually created in 1769, And it was shipped all around Europe and shown off, and people would play chess against it. Mechanical Turk was a reference to the fact that it was sort of a robot dressed up like somebody from the Ottoman Empire. So we had a little bit of exoticism worked into it as well, which made this a very, very popular attraction. Of course, it was fake. It was completely a hoax. There was like a chess master hidden in a box inside the machine who had mirrors and things to like move the pieces around. But for decades, people did not know how this worked and thought that maybe this was a legitimate contraption. So Charles Babbage, the English mathematician, saw this and actually played against it twice and got beat both times, said he thought it was probably a hoax, but didn't have any proof. He was inspired by this to design in 1820 his difference engine, which was the first mechanical device that could make, that could perform addition. It was the first calculator. He was not able to build it due to the limitations of the time. This was the Victorian era. There would have been like coal burning steam engines and things like that. It was just not feasible, but he had the plans for it anyways. And these plans were shown off at a party that Ada Lovelace happened to be attending. She was 19 years old, and she was the only person in the room, basically, who understood what this was all about and formed this long-lasting friendship with 40-something-year-old Charles Babbage. They would write letters back and forth. When an article was written about Charles Babbage's analytical engine, the next generation, Ada Lovelace translated an article about it from Italian into English, while adding her own notes and explanation for how this analytical engine would work, and also writing all the future uses that you could have for it, from writing music to doing all kinds of things, and wrote the very first ever computing algorithm. So this is why Ada Lovelace is considered, the first pioneer in the area of computer software. She did this all, in the 1820s at a very early age.
Yeah, pretty impressive.
It wasn't until 100 years later that we actually get the first physical mechanical computing devices. It's a relatively little known, outside of Spain, engineer who developed these, Leonardo Torres y Cavado. Leonardo Torres y Cavado, he was inspired by Babbage's designs. He wrote all kinds of papers about how he thought this could be developed in real life. The first thing that he did before he made the calculation machines was he built the first actual chess playing machine. Even before he got into the calculations, that's the direction that his mind went. It's very limited. It basically had a board on what, if you can kind of picture in your mind, like an old-fashioned record player cabinet, with the lid that lifts up and everything. And inset into that lid was a chessboard that only could have 3 pieces on it: a white rook, a white king, and a black king. And if you put that black king anywhere on the board, the computer would use magnets, and I say computer, even though it wasn't digital, it was just mechanical, but it would use magnets to move the white pieces around and checkmate the king eventually. And this was in 1912 that humanity finally had a chess playing machine. Now, the way that it worked is he had a programmed algorithm in the machine. An algorithm is just a series of if this, then that commands. So if the black king was here, then do this. If the black king is here, then do that. So it's basically like following the recipe. It's doing the exact same thing every single time. So this does not really meet our bar of intelligence just yet. I mean, to really be intelligent, you want the device to be able to not just exercise commands based on input, you want it to be able to draw conclusions based on that input. You want it to, to learn and remember. And so that is what's really been the quest for a long time. And so now we have machine learning where, if you're playing chess against a computer now, it can detect patterns in your gameplay and it can decide what to do based on those patterns. It hasn't been programmed with an algorithm based on, if we move here, then you move here. Instead, it's been given access to all the past games that have ever been played in like grandmaster tournaments. The computer analyzes those on its own and comes to its own conclusions about where the best place is to move a piece in order to achieve checkmate.
Yeah,
So
that's quite a jump.
yeah, it's a big change. And I mean, we've only started to be able to develop that since the 90s. In 1997, a computer actually beat a human at chess for the first time. So it took almost the entire 20th century of incremental improvements, and also technological improvements in other ways too. I mean, like I said before, Babbage was not able to build his machines that he had designed because he was limited by the materials and resources of the time. So in order to develop this, we had to not only figure it out, but we had to have, the processing power. We had to be able to have the microchips. We had to be able to have all of that in order to be able to, create this new way of playing chess.
Yeah, and Carolyn, it's so interesting. I think area we can chase a little bit is, okay, so here we are in 2024 and OpenAI released ChatGPT, I think in November of 2022, I think. And yet, kind of like Babbage, AI is set up in part by the data that's put into it, that it has access to, right? And so I can tell you as a researcher as well, something we're trained on is, you've maybe heard the axiom, garbage in, garbage out, right? Computers or devices that use AI don't really have total garbage going in necessarily. There are limitations and perhaps biases that can occur. So let's talk a little bit, if you can, and this is why, for our listeners and for those who are watching, we're giving historical context here because we want to understand, of course, where AI came from, but also what limitations it has, what are the risks with those limitations, and what it might look like as we continue to develop in this area, because obviously, like most other things, these are tools that we want to control, right? Carolyn, I'll kick it back over to you. Can you talk a little bit about the limitations, the inputs, and the potential risks of current AI capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that the input is essential in the quest to develop an AI that actually does what we want it to do. The thing about machine learning is it is what's called a black box technology. We can know what we're putting in and we know what comes out, but we don't really know how the AI is coming to the conclusions that it is regarding what is in that data. It's very difficult, at least as of yet, to get it to tell us. So we really have to scrutinize the data that goes in carefully. And there's been incidents where, for example, businesses want to, streamline their hiring process. So they have an AI for this purpose. They need to train the AI on what to recognize in resumes to identify who would be a good candidate for the position. So are uploaded and the computer starts its process. And after you look at several of the candidates that have been proposed or as acceptable and other candidates who have been put on the reject pile by the AI, you start to notice that there's some demographic issues that are coming up. And what has happened in the past is that, if all of the resumes from your company are predominantly not just, white and male and European, but, people who have gone to certain schools and played certain sports or have taken leaves of absence for certain amounts of time. These are things that the computer doesn't know. All it knows is that, oh, a lot of the people who've worked for this particular company have played for this particular kind of sport. So that must be something that we're looking for. That must be something good. So it doesn't really have the logical capability to evaluate the data that it's given. It's just looking for patterns. And that can cause, bad situations.
Sure, sure. No, it's interesting when in my conversations with other colleagues and professionals in the area that while the capabilities of modern AI are many and robust, still what a term I use, I don't know how accurate it is I don't feel like it has a lot of mental dexterity yet. And as a professor of strategy, for instance, when human beings who 50% of strategic decisions made by executives and boards running organizations don't work out. And these are humans that are well experienced, well educated, working as teams, trying to solve problems, and have more data at their fingertips than they know what to do with, including some AI data, right? Some AI things that are generated. And it's still, and so the point is, it is difficult. And I can see how, as far as programmers or when they're putting data into devices and technologies that use AI, that biases can surface. And to your point, they can cause a variety of things that can be risky to an organization's reputation, right?
Mhm.
So let me drill down a little bit. Maybe you can clarify for me. How is it a company like OpenAI? And I only know a little bit from what I read of them in the newspaper. I've never analyzed the company in depth or anything like that. How is it that we don't, can we study when the computers are making decisions? Is there any, they're having difficulty backtracking on how AI is making decisions? We can't seem
Yes,
to disentangle that yet.
right. I mean, that's not something that we've been able to do effectively. I mean, sometimes with an AI tool, you can ask it a question and it'll give you an answer, but that is not actually what it's doing. It is running a second query, which may or may not be exactly the steps that it took and what it was weighing in order to reach that decision. So there is a level of transparency that as of yet is missing.
Okay, okay. So with that, with us knowing that, what in your professional opinion, what can organizations do to try and mitigate these risks, control or utilize the tools, so that we don't cause harm? Because as we know, throughout human history, almost all tools, including things like just money, as an example, they're neutral. So with that being said, what could or should organizations do to try and get our arms around and make sure that we control AI tools so that it doesn't hurt our organizations or hurt any of our stakeholders?
Well, and I'm going to flip that question around a little bit because, we want to be able to have insight into the decisions that AI is making, and it's frustrating that we currently don't. But I mean, how much insight do we have currently into the decisions that we are making as humans? I mean, one of the things that we could do as a way of improving the situation is to talk a little bit more about metacognition, about implicit bias, and all of these things that have to do with why we make the decisions that we do when we might be unconscious of all of the things that are going into our decisions. And this is not an easy thing to do at all. I mean, I experimented with this in a class that I was teaching last semester where I had, my students using an AI tool to do a low-level project. and, do some reflecting and things like that, it was very difficult for them to authentically reflect on what exactly I had to do a paper when I was in grad school for my instructional design degree as well, where we had to basically write a paper on our process of writing a paper. And trying to do that was very, very difficult. It took us a while to even understand what the instructor was asking us to do. But then going back and thinking, well, what search engines did I use? And what terms did I put in? And why did I prioritize this article over that one? And things like that. Illustrates how it's not just the AI tools that we want to be more transparent. It is the people who are making decisions even without AI tools as well. And it's hard to be 100% cognizant of why we are making the decisions that we do.
Yeah, and Carolyn, that's so interesting because and not surprising, but certainly worthy of in-depth conversation, that there's a very high correlation or relationship between human behavior, our biases, how we make decisions, and if we're creating something as far as coding, programming, a tool that's coming from our hands, that those devices would reflect some of the errors and mistakes that we make, and we probably won't ever be able to fully eradicate those. However, to your point, I think it raises awareness and the need for understanding human behavior and human psychology, which we have a pretty deep body of research. And I know myself, for example, I'm certified in Hogan assessments, which is arguably the #1 tool in the world to predict workplace performance, workplace behavior of individuals. They have something, I think it's around 10 million people have taken their assessment, which has been developed over 40 years. And the founder, I believe it's Paul Hogan, he's in the Hall of Fames, if you will, both in the worlds of psychology and I think medicine as well. Let's talk from your training and your background between human history and technology. Let's talk about the human behavior element and maybe some tools, some courses or things maybe you've even worked on, because to your point, aside from the development of AI, individuals, we're going to have to be trained to utilize these tools, right? And also become aware of AI's shortcomings along with our shortcomings. So maybe you can talk about how organizations can maybe do that better.
Sure. Yeah, there's several places where we are interacting with AI through all kinds of stages of a decision-making process. So the first point of interaction between humans and AI is that initial data set, which is provided to the computer. So first of all, we need to look at where that data is coming from and whether it fits the goals that we have. It's things that are available online on the internet, and one of the sources of information, it's not the main source, but one of the sources of information that was used was Reddit, the Reddit threads. Have you spent a lot of time on Reddit yourself?
I haven't spent a lot, but I have been on there, and so I have a gist of their validity and reliability.
Right. I've spent some time on Reddit, not a lot, and it's like any other large internet platform. You've got some areas where you can have nice civilized conversations, and then you've got other areas where people are a little bit more ranty and feeding into each other and things like that. Reddit tends to be more popular among certain demographics than others. And so all of that is going to be built in to that data set if you are pulling from that particular area. So that sort of, I would say it's similar to the implicit bias in individual people in that it is not necessarily something we're seeking out intentionally. We have to look at those data sets that are produced by humans and decide if we need to balance, our streams of information with other sources that will get us a more widespread result. So that's point of contact number one, is just the identification of data streams and the information that is in them.
Carolyn, let me jump in here because I'd like to relate some from my background as well. That's really important for our listeners and our audience. It is common in the world today, and most people know that the algorithms and the designs of everything we've seen, just Facebook as an example, right? How it's changed and evolved over 10, 15 years, etc. That cater more to our likes, dislikes, and it kind of sends us down a tunnel or a pigeonhole where things we like to comment or be a part of versus not. So what I'm going to relate to Carolyn's point here as a professional folks is the concept of data, and the quality and the validity and reliability of that data is paramount. And with the advent of the internet, which is a phenomenal tool that people, so now we have access to a lot more information at a much more rapid rate, et cetera, et cetera. But in a world today proliferated with misinformation, as an example, universities hopefully play a role here. Someone as myself as a professor, where, and this is again especially for our listeners and audience, folks, the best research in the world. Let me give you an example. Textbooks. If you go and pick up a textbook on almost any subject matter, the only thing in those textbooks is the best research, empirical, statistical, peer-reviewed research in the world. That is different than just reporting, that is different than anecdotes, that is different than just life experience, it's different than just opinions. And so I'm saying that because the rigor that information, those findings have to go through to be put in a textbook, which is only basically our top tier journals, our A and A+ journals, where it's the best information research that humans can do at this point. That is much more reliable, and it's not me saying this is statistically proven. It's much more reliable, it's much more valid than pretty much all other sources. And I'm saying that because a lot of folks grapple with, where do I get high quality information? Can I trust it? Should I just doubt it? Should I denigrate the information to me? Things that, right? And that's part of us being a civilized society, where we have to be able to assess what is worthy of study, what's the quality of this information, because it is highly, highly correlated, the research process and the data that we use as professors and professional researchers, to what Carolyn is talking about that goes into what an AI tool has access to, right? And a lot of folks know this, not everyone does. So your ability to critique the information in the data sources is paramount for your ability to rely on that information and make decisions off it. Okay, Carolyn, thank you, Carolyn. Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree that the quality of that information is extremely important. And this is part of the reason why many companies and universities are creating their own internal AI tools that use a data set that is curated and produced by that particular company or that particular university. So they don't have to worry about, cross-contamination from other sources or anything like that. Yeah.
And Carolyn, too, I think the other thing that Carolyn just mentioned, folks, is when companies or universities do that, it's proprietary too. They create unique, highly reliable, highly valid data sets that for instance, when we think of organizations like Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters or Activism Insight as an example, that sell their data. So I'm bringing this up because the creation of these data sets that are highly reliable, highly valid, that are proprietary, it's not easy. It's a lot of work to do it, but there's value in it both for universities and organizations that can be shared with the world, but also has commercial opportunities as well, which I think that's important for our listeners to know.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could develop a AI tool that is based on a particular data set that, then if you want to share that with other universities or other institutions, you could do that as well. We need to actually train it using an algorithm. So this is sort of the second point of human contact is, the algorithms do not spring from nothing. The algorithms are developed by, programmers and developers of algorithms. So the process for creating that, the process for testing it so that you can identify, errors in logic or misinformation, that's all done by humans too. So humans are going to need to be able to put themselves in the shoes of a novice who does not know what the right answer is, so that when they get the computer to generate a response, they can assess that and determine whether the algorithm is working correctly or whether it needs to be fine-tuned. So that's another point of contact. So we've got the data set, we've got the algorithm. Both of those are, created and put forward by humans. The third step in the process is now that we have a functioning AI tool, the third point of human interaction is the input of a prompt. So the prompt is the question that we're asking the AI tool that we want it to answer. And it can be, a simple factual question like, what are the, top 10 movies by Quentin Tarantino or something like that. Or it could be something that is more analytical. A lot of times people use an AI tool to try and get insight into a group that they would like to reach out to or market something to. So I might ask my AI tool, how do I write this lesson on, I don't know, photosynthesis in a way that would appeal to Generation Z college students from South Florida or something like that. And there's pros and cons to this. It is an interesting way to look at a question in a way that is different from your own personal background and expertise. But at the same time, you've got to remember that data set, that algorithm, either one of those stages could have introduced flaws that will cause the computer to make, a poor conclusion. So there is a hazard of companies using carefully crafted prompts in an effort to try to address, deficiencies on their own team. They want to market to, let's say, East Asia. They don't have any East Asian people who they are currently interacting it with. Do you want to trust the computer's idea of what would be the best way to market to that group? Engineering is something that we're seeing a lot more courses on because it's an end user thing, whereas the algorithm and the data set, that's all made by people behind the scenes. But even if you have the most beautifully crafted prompt in the world, it may result in poor information if the algorithm and the data set are not quite as representative as you'd want them to be.
And Carolyn, again, I'm glad you brought up that point, because while you're describing one aspect of AI, it basically on the side something bubbles up. And can you talk about the importance of us, of human beings, using our critical thinking in conjunction with these powerful tools that we have?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we are going to have to get a lot sharper with, because it's hard to tell, first of all, when you are getting something, whether it is generated by an AI or a human. There are already marketing AI apps and tools that will let you, take a spreadsheet of customer demographics and take information about a new product, and then it's the AI's responsibility to tailor advertisements and texts and prompts and things like that, that each of those consumers gets. That's individualized based on their demographics, based on their search history, and things like that. So when I get a message from an advertiser, I really need to be looking at it. Like, is this something that actually came from a human being who knows me? Or is this something that somebody generated based on, you know, all kinds of different data points that I've left littered across the internet?
Yeah, no, and Carolyn, I'm glad you brought that up. Let me jump in here because I think while the theme of this podcast is about AI, equally important is what's coming to light is about us, about human beings and our ability to think, to utilize data, to find information, and to manage and handle tools that can compute and assess volumes of data much faster than we can, but don't have the mental dexterity. I'm going to use that word again, the mental dexterity that we have yet at this point, right? And a gentleman named Rob Folger, who is a professor at the University of Central Florida. He was arguably one of the founders of the field of business ethics. And one of the most powerful things he shared with me is, he said, Jason, he said, no matter the amount of research that is out there or data already, pull out a piece of paper or pull out your computer and type up what you think about the subject matter first. Whatever it is, do that first, and then start going and doing comparing and contrasting with what the current research says, what the best science says, etc. Because you never know where a great idea may come from, and you never know where you might come up with something that changes a field or turns it over or switches its angle. And let me give you a couple more salient examples of that. So I mentioned Dr. Hogan, who created the Hogan assessments. And I'll give you another one, and probably almost most people know, or a lot of people know, who Dr. Phil is, as an example. Both of them, trained psychologists, fell in the camp that they felt up until, oh boy, mid-1900s, maybe even 1960 or so. They felt that a lot of the psychology research was very ineffective. And so they characterize it as almost kind of bunk. And now hear me, I'm not trying to put down prior researchers, because research itself, just like AI development, is a process. But the point is, they were able to challenge some of the status quo, challenge some of the other tools of the day, and basically come up with things that have become much more effective and efficacious for us in our own critical thinking, but also tools that we have at our disposal. Because AI will help with this, but as you know, we have all kinds of analytical tools that help us perform all different types of regression, predictive modeling, et cetera, right? And AI can enhance that. But again, if we have these biases or potential where they're making decisions, the AI is making decisions that we can't really control, we have to understand that that's a reality, how to possibly handle that with risk management, how we can learn from it. So
I gotta figure out where I was.
let's see here. We were talking about the search, the prompts.
Oh, the prompt engine.
Individuals were at the prompts.
Okay. So, I mean, prompt engineering is something that's gonna continue to, here, let me put it this way. In addition to being a little bit skeptical about the message that we're receiving and whether they're generated by artificial intelligence or not, we also need to develop better critical thinking skills when we are analyzing the messages that we are sending out and the way that we are interacting with computers. You know, One of the things that I've looked at in the past is generations theory. I've been real big on this, since the 90s. I read, The Fourth Turning when I was in high school, where it posited like all the different generations that there've been in history and how they've interacted with each other and, things like that. So it's a fun way of looking at historical events and why sometimes people encounter things the way that they do. There have been a lot of books written recently about Generation Z and their very bad internet habits and their smartphone addictions and, all of these hazards that we see in this younger generation. But, if you look at history and the introduction of technology over time, for us, when we get something new, it takes us a while to adjust. Eventually we accept it and it's the new normal. You think of things like cars or telephones or the internet or something like that. We adjusted to it, and now it's hard to imagine life without those things. For the younger generations, whichever era that you're looking at, they are much, much faster to adopt that new technology and much less cognizant of the risks that might be involved, whereas the older people in that era, they're the ones who are going to be a little bit more cautious. So Generation Z, they are aware that there are privacy issues with some of their apps. They are aware that there's location tracking and the data might not always be, kept private and things like that. But because it's now a ubiquitous part of their world to have these tools, it's hard for them to imagine life without it. So transparency is very important to them. Data protection is important to them, but the onus is on the companies to preserve the data and things like that. There's not as much shopping around apps and looking at, the user agreements and things like that as we see in older generations, not because Generation X and everybody are, but just because we're older now and we've had these experiences, and so we're a little bit more cagey. Eventually Generation Z will grow older, and then we'll have something else coming along, and it'll be their turn to be horrified at how the younger generation is interacting with this technology. My daughter is a member of Generation Alpha, technically, which is right below Generation Z. And one of the things I do with her a lot is I try and talk to her about, the risks of different technology and, how sometimes they put things on your phone when you don't want it there. So we have to be careful of what we download and what we don't. And we have to make those good choices. When I was talking with my students in the fall about AI tools and things like that, they were very fuzzy on which tools actually used artificial intelligence and which didn't. They just didn't know it was there. So this gets me back to my main point. This is another aspect of critical thinking and analyzing the tools that you're using and being a little bit cautious and a little bit skeptical of the tools that you use. That's something that's a skill that needs to be developed, and it's developed gradually over time.
Carolyn, again, more interesting points I want to kind of piggyback off of. I'm saying this may not be completely true, but I'll give it a whirl here. It seems like in today's society that the levels of trust and transparency are becoming even more paramount. And in terms of how we conduct ourselves individually, but also as organizations are concerned.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, and I happen to be a parent of a young child as well, training people to be skeptical, critical thinkers of the information we ingest, right? Because if you roll the clock back, you don't have to roll it back too far, 50, 60 years, the access to information wasn't nearly as easy as it is now. And so it goes back to the point I made earlier that training for individuals, whether it comes through universities, whether it comes through our K through 12 systems, hopefully both, through even trade schools, hopefully the idea of being able to assess the quality of the information and its trustworthiness to the individual to make good decisions, otherwise it might harm them, but also for organizations, again, the trust and transparency issue, so that their customers, clients, stakeholders can trust them and not damage their reputation and wreck their organizations. To these that are very important. Life is complex. We have to be aggressive, lifelong learners in order to compete well and make better decisions. So Carolyn, I know we've got a little time left. Anything else? Any other major points you'd like to address either on AI, or do you want to talk more about some historical context and how people react? What would you like to discuss?
I want to go back real quick to your point about transparency and
Yeah.
the importance of it. And I think that this is definitely something that's going to continue to be a trend. One of the memes that you see a lot nowadays that the young people like to say to each other is, the show me the receipts. This is something that's came into pop culture in I think 2002, early 2000s. And it's, I think, a good motto for where we are now in technology and communications. When you think back to, when we were in high school, in college, growing up, there were no smartphones, there was no video of everything everywhere, there was no texting each other, there was none of that. We had telephones and we had face-to-face conversations, and occasionally you'd have some notes written on notebook paper and passed in the hallways and things like that. And there was nothing that was being preserved long-term. For a long time, when smartphones and things came out, this was an example of how much better things were back then. People would be like, oh, I'm so glad there weren't smartphones when I was in high school where people could have got videos of all this stuff that I was up to and things like that. That's a very long time ago to the people in their 20s and 30s today. And they are used to a world where their interactions have been documented. And you can go back and you can see exactly what was said and exactly what was done and all of that. So there is an expectation of transparency in social interactions that the AI technology has not caught up with yet. There's a definite push for it, but we don't have the ability to deliver it at the current moment. So I think that's something that we're going to see more and more of an impetus in that direction as we get more and more people in Generation Z moving into the workplace.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point, because I think there's something for our audience to know as well, because it is popular, and it's been popular throughout human history to talk about differences, right? Everything from generations to racial to gender, et cetera, et cetera. But Carolyn, specifically to your points, and these are meant to be words of encouragement here. As far as psychology is concerned, the differences between generations, for instance, is not nearly as deep as one might think based on pop culture. I say newspaper. I'm talking even if you read Apple News on your phone, right? Media. Okay. The truth is, those are statistically much less significant factors than the things that bind us. Not to be cliche, that bind us together. Let me be very explicit on these. The need for all of us to want to, most people, develop, achieve, learn, grow, be accepted, have friends, have social networks, to be loved. That is universal. And trends that are above that are a little bit more surface level, they're not to be ignored. But I know this as well as a professor, and a fair amount of my training and my background has been in psychology, and psychology in the workplace, is that you still reach people. You'll hear a lot of sayings, that, well, they're completely different. You have to reach them very differently. No, you don't. No, and I can tell you that from 25 years of experience of doing this in addition to my training. Now, I'm not saying you ignore, thanks to your point, Carolyn, about individuals who grew up with some of the tech that you and I did not have when we were younger. But my point is, you're aware of those factors, but you still reach them through their human needs and their desires. And so you know, I say this for our listeners, you know, whether popular or not, research shows that the pop arguments about huge generational differences are pretty much bunk.
Yeah.
They're not to be completely neglected, but they're pretty much bunk. And so those are the type of things we want to unearth and share with our listeners of what the best research on the planet says about those type of things.
Yeah,
So-
it's a shorthand way of referring to groups of people that is, I mean, it is a stereotype in the sense it's a generalization. You know, you can look at things like, you know, the Myers-Briggs personality tests the same way too. It is a useful way of looking at people, but nobody is 100% one of those personality types, and nobody is 100% a millennial or Gen Xer or anything else.
Carolyn, let's do this. Why don't we
We need a final thought.
yes, let's move to final thoughts.
Well, I mean, my final thoughts about where AI is going in society. So one thing that I think that we're going to continue to see conversations about regarding AI and ethics is how we interact with AI tools and how we expect them to interact with us. So we always have this worry of AI taking over. And so to kind of make people feel better, AI designers have worked very hard to make the AI tools be as considerate and encouraging. They never want to say that you're wrong. They never point out your inconsistencies in your arguments. They always apologize and take responsibility because that's how they're programmed. And that's supposed to make us feel better. It makes me feel like they're doing something sneaky behind our back. But you know, at least for now, that's how AI tools are programmed to communicate with us. If we are going to get the AI's help in overcoming some of our human failings, you know, biases and blind spots and things like that, we really want AI tools that hold us to the fire a little bit and say, listen, you've said this and you've said that, and these are two contradicting goals, and we need to ask you some follow-up questions in order to bring these two together. They're going to start to be in more and more things. You know, we already have, you know, little robot devices and things like that that look like a human, but they don't have to. They could be in anything in order to change how we interact with it. And I think of this a lot when I don't know if you watched the Marie Kondo specials when they were on Netflix, the Japanese organizer okay. So one of the things that's in her shows and her books a lot is she refers to the Japanese Shinto concept of kami, where everything, even inanimate objects, has a spiritual essence to it. And therefore, when you interact with these things, you need to be respectful. So in the show and in the books, she talks about when you have like a pair of shoes that you've worn for a long time and it's time for you to let it go, you should first thank it and show appreciation for it, show gratitude for it. And, you know, when this was brought on TV, a lot of people thought this was like, this is a really kooky thing. But it interacts with AI in the sense that, you know, we are going to be interacting with these devices that talk to us like we are, like they are people. So we should treat them a little bit. You know, I'm not going to go so far as saying the AIs need rights and things like that, but just, you know, the way that you interact with inanimate objects may change and evolve due to AI being a presence and, you know, AI changing how we interact with them.
Yeah, no, Carolyn, that's interesting. And I can imagine to our listeners, I'm sure that it's probably a mixed bag, right? Some people might be saying, oh, that's interesting. They're like, wow, that's an interesting thought. Other people, which is okay, might be rolling their eyes and saying that last part notion might be complete bunk, right? In their worldview, which is okay. I think um just one add-on to what you said is there is an element where the things that we create or make, that it involves human effort, human time, human commitment, resources, us putting our thought, part of who we are, into tools, devices, companies, organizations. In that sense, maybe you could make an argument that we are imbuing or imputing some of our human spirit into these things. Not that they fully, but the point is that these creations, these new things we developed, come from us, and so there's an element of the time and sacrifice and effort we put into it. So, Carolyn, thank you very much for your time. I might just conclude with a couple points myself here before we end. So, folks, what I can tell you, and so again, as a professor in a business school in the area of management who studies organizations, some important things to know historically about technology. We want one, and most people know this, but sometimes some recency bias or a lot of pop news can rattle people or scare people a little bit. Throughout human history, at different times, we've had quantum leaps in technology. And one of the good things about those is many times they make our lives better, make things more convenient for us. An important takeaway is empires, civilizations, or nation states that have the best technology or companies usually win. That's part of the reason so many countries around the world are driven to develop new things that can help us make sure we have a sustained competitive advantage as a nation state. These tools are oftentimes neutral. And of course, is there maybe a little bit more risk to AI since it's starting to make decisions on its own? Probably. I'd have to do a little research and think if I can find any devices that are comparable or what we could learn from those. But I think something else in terms of the world of work is, and we've seen this throughout the past century, even prior, it was always scary that a new technology meant a whole bunch of people would be out of work. And what the research has shown over the last 100 years in business is actually that new technologies create new industries and new jobs. Now, and that causes disruptions, right? And so because of that, as human beings, we have to retrain more often, we have to retool. And most of our listeners will know, for instance, who Warren Buffett and his dear friend Charlie Munger mentioned, one of the best things they've seen in the most successful people in life is they're just aggressive, lifelong learners. They don't stop learning, right? Which is part of the reason for the development of this inaugural podcast, because we hope to have experts like Carolyn on long to come into the future. So with that, Carolyn, again, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm sure our audience will benefit significantly. Listeners, thank you for tuning in to our inaugural podcast. We look forward to providing more content to you down the road.